Leota Adebayo, the classic fish out of water character in this very complex world of Peacemaker. And you see as we dig into this character how different she is from everyone else. Now, right off the bat, we see her as very smart, compassionate, and morally grounded, which puts her out of place in a world of killers, mercenaries, and jaded government operatives. Her placement in Amanda Waller's team is very delicate and it's very deliberate. Now, this is Amanda Waller's daughter, giving her both privilege and an impossible weight of expectations. Like, think about what her mother has accomplished. And this tension, wanting to honor her mother's mission and show that she's got the same genes while rejecting her mother's cold-blooded methods, this forms the spine of her character conflict. Now, most of the team leans into violence and cynicism. We have to think about, vigilante, hardcore, and even, a Peacemaker himself. What she provides is very different because she brings empathy. She's often the one on the team to remind the group that Peacemaker himself, despite his stupidity and trauma, is still a human. So when she has to go back and set him up, she really feels those things. So this role makes her the heart of the series, but it also isolates her because in this kill-first environment, caring too much is a liability. And psychologically, she's navigating this paradox of staying humane in a world that thrives on inhumanity. Now, she has a big burden of legacy. Like, being Amanda Waller's daughter means she's caught between her own values and the shadow of the mother who represents like ruthless pragmatism on a whole nother level. She is literally one of the most powerful black ops or covert operatives in the nation. She commands real power. So she's pressured to manipulate, spy, and even betray. Every time she does these things, she crosses her own personal line. She feels guilt just gnaw at her, and that's dissonance is central. She's living proof of how children of powerful parents often wrestle with whether to inherit, reject, or reinvent this legacy that's handed down to them. Now, she uses her friendship as survival in a lot of ways. She has a bond with Peacemaker that is genuine and fascinating. Now, at first she sees him as this dangerous buffoon, which is kind of true. But the thing that she hangs on to is that she recognizes the trauma that shaped him. She looks at his family circumstance. She looks at how people react to him. And this empathy allows her to connect with him on a deep level, way deeper than most connections he's had. And you could tell the importance of this to him. Now, psychologically, this is also protective. She's finding an ally in the chaos and redemptive. She's subconsciously trying to prove that she's not her mother by choosing to connect over just being manipulation. So she has a core archetype being the conscience of the team. She really stands out in that role. She's also the moral outsider and the heart. And her conflicts are personal ethics and this inherited power structure. She has a lot of growth. She learns that kindness doesn't mean weakness and it can coexist with strength even in this brutal world. But we see her, like, what's been highlighted about her personal relationship, I think the only one who had a loving relationship, at least going into it. And right off the bat, Hardcore was like, no, you got to cut that out. You got to nix that, because that's what this world forces people to do. So this is an interesting journey that we're seeing the one character who has heart, who cares, who has empathy, trying to navigate her way through this absolutely ruthless world. And we'll see. I'm kind of rooting for her, and I think most people are. But this is the core of who Adebayo is, and I think we'll see a lot of growth from her as the series develops.